Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the United States military just ran out of ammunition and nobody in Washington is telling you, not metaphorically, not in some distant future scenario, right now in real time, the arsenal of democracy has been severed at the artery, and the weapon used wasn't a missile or a cyber attack. It was a rock, a dull gray metal that most Americans have never heard of. Yet without it, every bullet in every rifle becomes nothing more than an expensive paperweight. While the media cycles through its daily theater of political drama, something far more consequential has occurred. China has officially banned the export of three critical minerals to the United States: gallium, germanium, and antimony. These aren't luxury goods. These aren't commodities you can simply substitute or work around. These are the foundational elements that make kinetic warfare possible. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. The United States has not produced a single ounce of antimony since 2001. Not 1 ounce. For 23 years, we have been utterly, completely, catastrophically dependent on the very nation we've identified as our primary geopolitical rival. Let me give you a number that will help you understand the scale of what we're discussing. 91.6%. That is the percentage of U.S. Navy weapon systems that are dependent on Chinese processed critical minerals. This isn't a vulnerability buried in some obscure supply chain. This is the kill switch, and it's baked into the hull of every destroyer, embedded in every radar system, wired into every advanced weapons platform we've built over the past 2 decades. Here's another number: 0. The amount of domestic antimony mine production in the United States between 2001 and 2024. We have been flying blind, friends. The most powerful military in human history, spending $840 billion annually on defense, has outsourced the very ingredients that make its weapons function to the nation it's preparing to potentially fight. This is not a policy failure. This is a structural fault line, and it has just cracked wide open. This is not a trade dispute. This is not a tariff negotiation. This is resource warfare, and the first shot has already been fired. The question is not whether this will reshape global power. The question is whether anyone will notice before it's too late. Now, I need you to understand something fundamental about antimony, because this is where the entire illusion collapses. Antimony is the primary ingredient in the primer, that small cap at the base of every bullet that sparks the gunpowder. Without it, a rifle is just a club. A tank round is just a sculpture. The entire kinetic architecture of modern warfare simply does not function, and we don't make it. We haven't made it for over 2 decades. How did we get here? The answer takes us back to a specific moment, a specific place, and a specific decision that set this catastrophe in motion. The year was 2001. The location was the Sunshine Mine in Idaho. This was the last domestic producer of antimony in the United States. It closed its doors not because the metal wasn't valuable, not because the demand disappeared, but because China undercut the price. Chinese producers flooded the global market with cheap antimony, making American production economically unviable. And so we made a choice. We chose short-term cost savings over long-term strategic security. We chose the illusion of efficiency over the reality of sovereignty. That closure didn't make headlines. There were no emergency congressional hearings. No one rang the alarm bell. The arsenal of democracy simply outsourced its ammunition supply chain to Beijing, and everyone went about their day. This leads us to the system's most crucial secret, which we will explore in detail. But first, you need to understand the mechanism at work. Think of antimony as the yeast in bread. It's a tiny ingredient, barely visible in the final product, but without it, the dough doesn't rise, the bread doesn't bake. In ammunition, antimony serves a similar function. It's not the bulk of the bullet, but it's the element that makes the entire system work. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Even if we were to find antimony deposits in a friendly country, say Tajikistan or Bolivia, we still face an insurmountable problem. The rock must be refined, processed, turned from ore into usable metal. And who controls 90% of global refining capacity for these critical minerals? China. This is what I call the refining choke point. You cannot build a non-Chinese supply chain when China owns the only kitchen that can cook the raw ingredients. It's not enough to mine the rock. You need the industrial infrastructure to process it, and that infrastructure takes decades to build. China understood this 20 years ago. They didn't just corner the market on these materials. They cornered the knowledge, the facilities, the entire industrial ecosystem required to turn ore into ammunition. Now, the United States military isn't stupid. They saw this vulnerability coming, or at least they should have. That's why we have something called the National Defense Stockpile. This is supposed to be our insurance policy, our strategic reserve for exactly this kind of scenario, warehouses full of critical materials that can keep the defense industrial base running even if supply chains collapse. So surely we must have stockpiled enough antimony to weather this storm, right? Wrong. The stockpile was sold off. Between the late 1990s and 2020, the antimony reserve dropped from 27,000 tons to less than 5,000 tons. It was liquidated, sold to pay for other budgets, treated as a fungible asset rather than a strategic lifeline. By the time China pulled the trigger on this ban, our safety net had already evaporated. We had been walking a tightrope without realizing the net below us was gone. This brings us to December 2024. This is the trigger event, the moment when the edifice began to crack. China didn't just restrict exports. They didn't just add paperwork or quotas. They implemented a total ban on gallium, germanium, and antimony exports to the United States. This was the nuclear option of trade warfare. No negotiations, no gradual phase-in, immediate and total severance of supply. The impact was instant. Defense contractors who had been operating on just-in-time supply chains suddenly found themselves staring at dwindling inventories with no way to replenish them. This wasn't a market adjustment. This was a supply shock, and it exposed just how fragile the entire system had become. Let me show you the canaries in the coal mine, the specific evidence that proves this rot is real. First, the price spike. Antimony prices in Europe and the United States surged 250% year over year following the initial restrictions. But here's what's fascinating. This price spike completely decoupled from Chinese domestic prices. Inside China, antimony remained cheap and available. Outside China, it became scarce and expensive. This is the signature of a weaponized commodity. The price isn't rising because of scarcity in nature. It's rising because of scarcity by design. Second, the panic contracts. The Pentagon rushed a $245 million sole source contract to United States Antimony Corporation to desperately try and replenish the stockpile. Let me translate that term for you. Sole source contract means you are our only hope. It means the government has bypassed the normal competitive bidding process because there is no competition. There is no one else. This is panic buying at the sovereign level, and it tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the Pentagon is taking this threat. Third, the tech casualty. Gallium is essential for AESA radars, the advanced radar systems used in F-35 fighter jets. It's critical for night vision goggles, for missile guidance chips, for every piece of technology that gives American forces their technological edge. The ban explicitly targeted these dual-use technologies, leaving manufacturers with dwindling reserves and no clear path to resupply. Now you might be thinking, surely we can fix this. Surely America, with all its resources and ingenuity, can simply start mining these materials again. Surely we can break free from this dependency. And here's where the trap closes completely, where the no escape encirclement becomes clear. If we try to mine it here, we face a brutal reality. It takes 10 to 15 years to permit a new mine in the United States. The Stibnite Gold Project in Idaho, which contains significant antimony deposits, has been stuck in permitting for over a decade. Environmental reviews, stakeholder consultations, legal challenges, regulatory hurdles. The process is designed for caution, not speed. Even if we fast-tracked everything starting today, we wouldn't see meaningful production until the mid-2030s. If we try to buy it elsewhere, we run into the refining monopoly. China controls the processing infrastructure. Even ore mined in Africa or South America must flow through Chinese refineries to become usable metal. There is no alternate route. The kitchen belongs to Beijing. And here's the move that reveals the true nature of this game. In November 2025, China suspended the ban for 1 year. At first glance, this might look like a retreat, a de-escalation. But friends, this was not mercy. This was a demonstration of power. China showed the world that it can turn the lights off whenever it wants and then turn them back on just as easily. The message is clear. Your military operates at our discretion. This is the mathematical endgame we've been building toward. We are now facing a convergence, friends, a perfect storm of three distinct forces hitting simultaneously, and each one amplifies the others. Let me walk you through what I call the trifecta of kinetic paralysis. Force number one, depleted stockpiles. The United States government didn't just fail to maintain its strategic reserves, it actively sold them off, treating national security assets like surplus inventory in a warehouse liquidation. That antimony stockpile that dropped from 27,000 tons to under 5,000, that wasn't negligence, that was policy. Bureaucrats decided that the monetary value of those reserves was more useful in the general fund than sitting in a warehouse preparing for a crisis that seemed abstract and distant. They sold the fire extinguisher to pay for renovations, and now the building is burning. But it gets worse, because it's not just about the quantity that was sold. It's about the signal that sale sent to the market. When the US government liquidates its strategic stockpiles, it tells private industry that this material isn't strategically critical anymore. It tells mining companies not to invest in domestic production. It tells refiners to shutter their facilities because the government itself doesn't value the supply chain. We didn't just deplete our reserves, we dismantled the industrial knowledge base required to rebuild them. Force number two, the green conflict. And this is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody is discussing. Antimony isn't just used in ammunition primers, it's also a critical component in solar panels, specifically in the photovoltaic cells that convert sunlight into electricity. So now you have two massive government priorities: the green energy transition and the defense industrial base fighting over the same limited pool of resources. The Biden administration pledged to accelerate solar deployment as part of its climate agenda. Billions in subsidies, tax incentives, infrastructure investments, all designed to flood the market with renewable energy. But every solar panel requires materials that are also needed for national defense. We are literally robbing the armory to build the solar farm. And here's the cruel irony. Most of those solar panels are manufactured in China using Chinese processed antimony. So we're funding China's industrial base while simultaneously depleting the materials we need for our own defense. The contradiction isn't just embarrassing, it's existential. Force number three, the radar gap. While America has been sleepwalking through this supply chain crisis, China has been sprinting ahead in the sensor war. Gallium nitride, or GaN, is the foundation of next generation radar technology. It allows for more powerful, more efficient, more compact radar systems that can detect threats at greater distances with higher precision. The country that dominates GaN production will dominate the electromagnetic spectrum, and the electromagnetic spectrum is where modern wars are won or lost. China is now deploying gallium nitride radars faster than the United States, and it's not because their engineers are smarter or their technology is more advanced. It's because they have unfettered access to the raw materials. They control the gallium supply, they control the refining, they can iterate, experiment, and scale production without worrying about supply chain interruptions. Meanwhile, American defense contractors are rationing their existing gallium stocks, trying to stretch limited inventories across multiple programs, making impossible choices about which weapon systems get priority. This is what a structural disadvantage looks like. It's not dramatic, it's not cinematic, there's no Pearl Harbor moment, no single catastrophic failure. It's a slow strangulation, a gradual erosion of capability that happens in spreadsheets and procurement meetings and factory floors. And by the time it becomes undeniable, by the time the gap is visible to everyone, it's far too late to close it. Now, I need to shift gears here, friends, because this is no longer about minerals or supply chains or geopolitical chess moves. This is about your mind. This is about the psychological trap that prevents people from seeing what's right in front of them. Human beings are hardwired to believe that tomorrow will look like yesterday. This is called normalcy bias, and it is one of the most dangerous cognitive vulnerabilities we possess. Your brain, faced with evidence of a massive systemic shift, will default to dismissing it. It will search for reasons why this time is different, why the alarm is overblown, why things will somehow work themselves out the way they always have. This is not stupidity. This is evolution. For most of human history, assuming continuity was the safe bet. The sun rose yesterday, so it will probably rise tomorrow. The harvest came last year, so it will probably come next year. But we are living through a period where the fundamental architecture of the global system is being rewritten. The assumptions that held for the past 70 years, the assumptions of American military dominance, of open trade routes, of available commodities, of supply chains that just work, those assumptions are collapsing. And your normalcy bias is actively preventing you from adjusting to this new reality. Let me give you a specific example of how this plays out. Right now, today, there are defense analysts and Pentagon officials who are downplaying this antimony crisis. They're saying things like, we have enough inventory to last through the next few years, or we're developing alternative supply chains, or China won't actually maintain this ban because it would hurt their own economy. These are all manifestations of normalcy bias. They are sophisticated, credentialed people engaging in wishful thinking because the alternative, accepting that America's military supremacy has a critical and potentially unfixable vulnerability, is too psychologically uncomfortable. But here's what they're missing. The timeline matters. Yes, current inventories might last a few years, but building a new mine, constructing refining facilities, training workers, establishing quality control, integrating new suppliers into existing weapons programs, all of that takes 10 to 15 years minimum. So you have a 3-year supply buffer to solve a 15-year problem. The math doesn't work. The window for action has already closed, and we're only now beginning to have the conversation. This connects to another psychological phenomenon I need you to understand, the kinetic fallacy. You obsess over how many aircraft carriers the US Navy has. You count fighter jets and tanks and missile silos. You look at the order of battle and you see American superiority everywhere. 10 nuclear-powered supercarriers, fifth-generation stealth fighters, precision-guided munitions, hypersonic weapons programs. The hardware is impressive. The technology is cutting edge. But an aircraft carrier without ammunition is just a floating hotel. An F-35 without radar components is just an expensive sculpture. The war is being lost in the mines, friends, not on the battlefield. The conflict isn't kinetic yet. It's economic, it's industrial, it's happening in the unsexy world of raw materials and refining capacity. And that's precisely why most people don't see it. We're conditioned to think of military power in terms of things that explode and move fast. We ignore the boring stuff, the supply chains and the logistics and the material science, and that's exactly where we're most vulnerable. China understands this. They've studied American military history. They know that the United States won World War II not because we had better soldiers or better tactics, but because we had better logistics. We could outproduce the Axis powers. We could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. We turned Detroit into a war machine and buried our enemies under an avalanche of steel. That was our strategic advantage, industrial depth. Now that advantage has been inverted. China is the world's factory. China controls the refining capacity. China can scale production in ways that America simply cannot. Not in the current configuration, not with our current industrial base. They've studied our playbook and they've figured out how to flip it against us. This isn't about stealing technology. This is about controlling the foundational inputs that make technology possible. Let me bring this to a specific, tangible point. Last year, the Pentagon issued a report on critical mineral dependencies. Buried on page 47 was a sentence that should have been the headline of every newspaper in America. It said, "The United States has become dependent on foreign sources for nearly all of the critical minerals necessary for modern weapon systems. Not some, not many, nearly all." Think about what that means. We have designed, built, and deployed the most technologically advanced military in human history, and we have made it entirely dependent on materials we don't control. This is not a flaw in the plan. This is the plan. 30 years of globalization, of chasing efficiency, of maximizing profit margins has left us strategically exposed in ways that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. Your grandfather's military operated on steel, aluminum, and oil. Those are abundant, those are fungible, those have multiple global sources. Your military operates on antimony, gallium, rare earth elements, exotic alloys that exist in only a few places and can only be processed by a few countries. And the country that controls most of those choke points has just demonstrated its willingness to use that control as a weapon. So where does that leave us? What is the way out of this trap? And this is where I need to present you with a choice, friends, a binary decision that cuts through all the complexity and gets to the heart of what's actually happening. The question is this: do you trust a system that outsourced its own ammunition ingredients to its adversary? Do you believe that the same institutions that allowed this vulnerability to develop over 23 years are capable of fixing it in the 3 years before the current stockpiles run dry? Do you think the bureaucracy that sold off the strategic reserves will suddenly develop the foresight and urgency needed to rebuild them? If your answer is yes, then you don't need to do anything. You can go back to watching the spectacle, trusting that someone somewhere has a plan, believing that American ingenuity will save the day at the last moment like it always does in the movies. But if your answer is no, if you see this for what it actually is, a structural fault line that cannot be papered over with good intentions and emergency contracts, then you need to start thinking about resource warfare, not as an abstract geopolitical concept, but as an investment thesis. Look at the companies that are trying to break this chokehold. because they're not just mining stocks, friends, they are defense derivatives. They are positional plays on the reshoring of American strategic independence. Perpetua Resources, ticker symbol PPTA, is developing the Stibnite Gold Project in Idaho. This is the same region where the Sunshine Mine once operated before it was shuttered in 2001. They're navigating the permitting nightmare, fighting through the environmental reviews, trying to bring domestic antimony production back online. United States Antimony Corporation, ticker UAMY, just received that $245 million sole source contract from the Pentagon. The U.S. government has explicitly identified them as critical to national security. Now, I'm not telling you to buy these stocks. I'm not giving you financial advice. What I'm telling you is that the U.S. government has just admitted in the most explicit terms possible that it has a critical vulnerability and it needs to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to fix it. When the Pentagon panics, when they bypass normal procurement processes and throw money at a problem, that tells you something about the severity of the threat. These companies aren't speculative plays on future demand. They are lifeboats in a storm that has already begun. But here's what's more important than any individual stock position. You need to understand that we are witnessing a fundamental shift in how power operates. For the past 70 years, the global system has run on a very simple principle. America provides security, and in exchange, America gets access to resources. We defend the shipping lanes, we maintain the global order, and commodities flow freely to wherever they're needed. That system is breaking down, not gradually, not theoretically, right now, in real time. China's antimony ban is a proof of concept. It's a demonstration that resource nationalism can be wielded as a strategic weapon without firing a single shot. And if it works, if America cannot respond effectively, then every other country with a critical resource is taking notes. What happens when rare earth elements get banned? What happens when lithium supplies get weaponized? What happens when the cobalt supply from the Democratic Republic of Congo becomes contingent on political alignment? We are entering an era where the most valuable assets are not financial instruments or digital currencies or even gold, though gold has its place. The most valuable assets are the physical resources that enable industrial civilization to function, the metals, the minerals, the materials that cannot be printed, cannot be synthesized, cannot be wished into existence by central bank policy. This is the transition from illusion to reality that I've been warning about. For decades, we've lived in a world of paper wealth, where numbers on screens represented claims on future production, where debt could be monetized away, where liquidity could be conjured through quantitative easing. But you cannot print antimony, you cannot ease gallium into existence. These are physical constraints, geological realities that don't care about your portfolio allocation or your Fed policy. The people who understand this shift, who position themselves accordingly, will preserve their wealth through what's coming. The people who remain anchored to the old paradigm, who believe that stock market indices and bond yields are the measures of prosperity, are going to experience a very rude awakening. Because when the system breaks, when the supply chain seize, when the kinetic paralysis becomes undeniable, those paper claims are going to reveal themselves for what they truly are, promises that cannot be kept. Now, let me address the counter argument, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, this is overblown. China suspended the ban for a year. They're backing off. The crisis is averted. And this is precisely the trap. This is exactly the normalcy bias I warned you about. China suspended the ban because they achieved their objective. They proved they have the kill switch. They demonstrated to every defense contractor, every Pentagon planner, every allied nation that relies on American military protection, that the arsenal of democracy operates at Beijing's discretion. The suspension isn't a retreat, it's a reminder. It's China saying, we can do this whenever we want, and you cannot stop us. Think about what that does to deterrence. The entire foundation of American military power is the credible threat of overwhelming force. Adversaries don't challenge us because they believe we have the capability and the will to respond decisively. But what happens to that deterrence when China can simply turn off the ammunition supply? What happens to our alliances when Taiwan or Japan or South Korea realizes that American security guarantees are contingent on Chinese resource exports? This is a psychological defeat dressed up as a temporary reprieve. And the fact that most Americans don't even know it happened, that it barely made the news cycle, that we're more concerned about the latest political scandal than the fact that our military has been structurally compromised, that tells you everything about how this story ends. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And we've seen this pattern before. In the 1930s, Japan's decision to invade Southeast Asia was driven largely by resource constraints. They needed oil, rubber, and metal to fuel their military ambitions, and the United States had imposed an embargo. The resource war preceded the shooting war. The battle for materials determined the eventual outcome. We are living through a similar inflection point, except this time America is Japan. We're the resource-dependent power that has overextended itself, that has allowed its industrial base to atrophy, that has relied on globalization to paper over strategic vulnerabilities. And China is playing the long game, methodically tightening the noose, waiting for the moment when the leverage becomes insurmountable. The window for preparation is closing, friends, not in some abstract future, not in a decade, right now. The companies that are trying to rebuild domestic supply chains are years away from meaningful production. The stockpiles are depleted. The alternatives don't exist. We are in the gap, the dangerous period where the old system has failed, but the new system hasn't been built yet. So what do? You recognize that this is not a market timing question. This is not about catching the bottom or riding the momentum. This is about positioning yourself for a world where physical resources matter more than financial engineering. You look at strategic materials, companies with actual production, tangible assets that will hold value when the paper burns. You consider precious metals not as a speculation, but as insurance against the systemic fragility that is now undeniable. You think about supply chain resilience in your own life, the products you depend on, where they come from, what happens if those flows get disrupted. You prepare for a world where efficiency gives way to redundancy, where just in time becomes just in case. And most importantly, you stop believing the narrative that everything will somehow work itself out. That faith in institutional competence, that assumption that the adults in the room have a plan, that belief has been empirically disproven. The same people who sold the stockpiles, who allowed the mines to close, who outsourced the ammunition supply chain to Beijing, are not going to suddenly develop the wisdom and courage needed to fix this mess. The resolution is not coming from Washington, it's coming from the market, from the brutal correction that happens when reality reasserts itself over illusion. And in that correction, there will be winners and losers. The winners will be the people who owned real things, tangible assets, strategic resources. The losers will be the people who owned promises, paper claims, financial abstractions that evaporate when the system breaks. This is not doom-mongering, friends. This is pattern recognition. Every empire that has ever fallen has followed a similar trajectory. They overextend militarily, they financialize their economy, they outsource their production, they lose control of critical resources. And then, when the crisis comes, When the test arrives, they discover that all the wealth on their balance sheets cannot buy them the materials they need to defend themselves. Rome couldn't mine enough silver to pay its legions. The Spanish Empire exhausted its gold reserves fighting wars across Europe. The British Empire discovered that controlling the financial system didn't matter when they couldn't manufacture enough steel. The pattern is always the same. Financial power is downstream of industrial power, and industrial power is downstream of resource power. And right now, America is losing on the resource level, which means everything else is built on sand. China understands this. They've been preparing for this for 30 years. While we were celebrating the end of history and the triumph of liberal democracy, they were quietly buying mines, building refineries, securing supply chains. They played the long game while we chased quarterly earnings, and now the bill is coming due. The antimony ban is just the opening move. It's the warning shot. It's China showing the world what the new rules look like, and the response from Washington has been tepid, bureaucratic, insufficient, a few $100 million here, some emergency contracts there, but no fundamental restructuring, no crash program to rebuild industrial capacity, no acknowledgement that we are in a different era with different rules. So I'll leave you with this. The transition from illusion to reality is not a smooth process. It's violent, it's chaotic, it destroys the assumptions people have built their lives around, but it also creates opportunity for those who see it coming. The people who positioned themselves ahead of 2008 preserved their wealth while everyone else got wiped out. The people who understood the inflation dynamics of 2021 bought hard assets while everyone else stayed in cash. This is a similar moment, except the stakes are higher. This isn't just about your portfolio. This is about the architecture of global power, and that architecture is crumbling. The question is whether you're going to cling to the old structure as it collapses, or whether you're going to position yourself for what comes next. History favors the prepared, friends, and the window for preparation is closing. The U.S. military just ran out of ammunition, and nobody told you. But now you know. Now you cannot unknow it. Now you have to decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. The choice, as always, is yours. But make no mistake, choosing to do nothing is still a choice. And in this environment, inaction is the riskiest position of all. Thank you for being here today. Stay vigilant, stay prepared, and remember, when the liquidity tide goes out, we're about to find out who's been swimming naked.